I'm Jim Nathan, one of the founders of Floridians for Democracy. I'm joined by the visionary of this effort, Karen Nathan. We're honored by your participation and that of our nationally known expert panelists. It's been decades since the last major American comprehensive immigration reform. Throughout the 249 now plus years of our nation's history, there have been moments where we appeared headed toward a true multicultural society with equal treatment for all, as depicted by the message of the Statue of Liberty. Nevertheless, we have a checkered history where cruelty and dehumanization have periodically become our policy du jour. In recent years, cruelty has increased, intensifying in recent months. Hence, we've assembled an impressive panel to help us understand the current situation as we ask, who is an American? Then our September 25th program will grapple with another timely and significant question. Can the Supreme Court protect our democracy? Folks, we are in what's called Zoom focus mode. You can see the panelists and yourself on the screen, but not all the other participants. Submit your questions to Bill Petrarca, one of our founders, or to me, and the questions will be relayed to our moderator, Mike Canary, award-winning journalist with WGCU. Later, time permitting, we will close the Zoom focus mode and open for additional questions, so you'll see everybody's face. And then you can ask questions by using the icon down at the bottom, the raise hand Zoom icon. And now I'm going to call on Karen for just a couple brief words, and then we're ready for our program.
I listened to the promo recording on Birthright Citizenship that Mike, Hannah, and Ira made for WGCU. These folks know the who, what, where, when, why, how on this important topic, and I am thrilled that they are with us this evening. Mike?
I hope by these folks you mean Hannah and Ira, because I only know what I learned that morning, sort of. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Karen. Thanks to everybody with Floridians for Democracy. I'm happy to be able to moderate these kinds of discussions and do things on Gulf Coast Life. I'm happy to be in a position to be able to do that during these times. I'm Mike Canary for people who aren't in Southwest Florida. I'm a radio producer and host at WGCU. I make a show called Gulf Coast Life, which I had Hannah and Ira on the other day, and another show called Three Song Stories. I'm also the broadcast news director. So as Karen just mentioned, I did have a chance to talk to Ira and Hannah on the show recently. So some of what we talk about tonight will overlap with that. So I hope it's not too much like deja vu for anybody who listened to that, or for you, Ira, or you, Hannah, because some of this will be very much similar. But we have a lot more time tonight, so we can get into some of the details that we had to kind of glaze past in a 27-minute conversation. So just to introduce Ira and Hannah, Ira is a nationally recognized immigration attorney. He's a founding partner at Kurzban, Tetzeli, and Pratt in Coral Gables. He also wrote a book called Kurzban's Immigration Law Sourcebook, which is considered like the definitive book on U.S. immigration law that attorneys and judges use. And Hannah Steinberg is a staff attorney with the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project. The ACLU is part of some of the cases we're going to be talking about, so Hannah kind of has a front row seat in some senses. So to begin, I just want to have each of you, have a chance to introduce yourselves and just tell the panelists or the participants or the people watching, a little bit about yourself. Ira, start with you. I asked you the other day on the show, like, what got you into immigration law, so you don't really have to go into that, but just tell us a bit about your background and how long you've been working in this realm.
Okay. Did you want me to start, Mike?
Yes, please.
Okay. I've been practicing immigration law for, I hate to say how long, but it's been about 45 years. I started my career as a civil rights lawyer and a labor lawyer, and then was asked to represent Haitian refugees in Florida. And for those of you who've been in Florida for a long time, you may remember years ago when the government was trying to deport most Haitians. I worked with the Haitian Refugee Center and did a number, actually over 12 class action lawsuits in an environment that wasn't much different than the environment we're seeing now, but much more localized to Miami-Dade County in Florida, the government had a Haitian program designed to kick all Haitians out of the U.S. We brought a number of class action lawsuits, and I argued a number of cases in the United States Supreme Court. My background is I was the national president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. I teach immigration law, have a practice for many years. And we're spending a lot of our time these days, as is Hannah, who's spending all of her time fighting the Trump administration and a number of their policies. We just won a case on July 1st where the Trump administration tried to cut back temporary protected status for Haitians by 6 months. They just decided on their own that they were going to do it, even though Haitians had 18 months. And a judge in the Eastern District of New York ruled on July 1st that the government had no authority to do that. So it's a small win, but at least it's a win of requiring the government to give temporary protected status to Haitians until February 3rd, 2026. Tonight, I guess they've asked us to talk about the citizenship cases, and Hannah has been much more involved in that, so I'm going to turn it over to Hannah on that. I'm sure, Hannah, you can tell them about all the cases you're doing and what the ACLU is doing.
Yeah, Hannah, your turn. Tell us a bit about yourself, and then we'll get into some of these cases and then broaden it out from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. And yeah, thank you for spending your evening with us talking about this important issue. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I grew up in California originally. And, in college, I knew I wanted to go to law school. I knew I wanted to do public interest law specifically. But it wasn't until right before law school that I really became interested in immigration. And that was a time period when, a lot of people were migrating, primarily from the Northern Triangle countries. So El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. And we were beginning to see family detention even before the first Trump administration. And I became really interested in immigration, given how much was going on at that time. And then, shortly after I started law school, President Trump was elected the first time. And as he has done now, and as we'll talk about, he really made immigration such a huge part of his agenda. And so it naturally became an area to really focus my time, and especially on impact litigation, which we're going to talk about. So I spent a lot of time working on a challenge to President Trump's decision to wind back the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which helped young people who had been brought to the United States as children to have deferred action and not be deported, get work authorization, et cetera. So I was working on that case. Worked a little bit on family separation as well, which has also been a focus of the ACLUs. Then, came to the ACLU 3 years ago. It was a pretty different time, certainly. And, with the last administration, there was plenty going on, but not the level of activity that we're seeing now. We have been working on a number of different issues, including birthright citizenship. I've been spending a lot of my time on this, and I'm really excited to talk about it. In addition, I've also been spending time on some of our challenges to courthouse arrests that are affecting folks who are showing up to immigration court for their hearings and then are being arrested and placed into what's called expedited removal, fast track deportation with no ability to apply for asylum or any other sort of immigration relief, just fast tracked out of the country. We have many people who have been working on the litigation challenging the Alien Enemies Act invocation that this administration has used to send Venezuelans to El Salvador. So we have a whole team of people that have been working on that. Also, folks have been working on cases supporting folks who have been targeted based on their activism. Mahmoud Khalil is one of those cases, but we've also worked on a number of others. And then finally, we actually have been working on some state cases, including out of Florida. Florida earlier this year passed an illegal entry and re-entry law that makes it a crime for an undocumented person to enter the state of Florida and allows Florida officers to arrest and detain people based on that, sets a 9-month mandatory minimum, and then essentially people get turned over to ICE. So we were able to secure an injunction against that law, which is really great. But we still have a decent amount of state work happening in the background as well in Florida, Texas, Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma are some of the states that have similar laws that we've been working on.
Wow, busy time. I had Ira do this last time, but I'm going to let you try, Hannah, or do Hannah. So let me just kind of give the basics. So birthright citizenship has roots in English common law. The 14th Amendment lays it out. The 1898 case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark, clarified it. Are those the main key points that lead us into the modern era with what we consider to be birthright citizenship?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Ira, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So, birthright citizenship is a principle that's older than this country. So it goes back to English common law, as you noted, Mike. And there's, for example, a case called Calvin's case that actually explores this concept in British law, and finds that anyone born in the country, with some exceptions, which we'll talk about, was a citizen, no matter the status of their parents. Quite a simple rule and quite a broad rule as well. And that was the rule that was imported from Britain to the United States before the founding. So all of the colonies had that rule. That was just sort of what was followed in the United States. And then there was a break from that rule, which people probably will be familiar with, the Dred Scott case. And so that case broke from the principle of birthright citizenship, no matter the status of one's parents, by finding that the child of enslaved people, African Americans, was not a citizen. And so then the 14th Amendment sought to not only remedy that, but also restore the broad notion of birthright citizenship as it had existed. And so, it certainly was about Dred Scott, but it was also about restoring the broader, common law notion of this. And then, Mike, as you noted, the Wong Kim Ark case came about. Interestingly, actually, Mr. Wong Kim Ark actually was born very close to where I'm sitting right now in San Francisco, just about a block away. He was born to Chinese national parents, but born here in San Francisco in the United States. His parents at the time of his birth were barred from naturalizing. They were able to stay in the United States, but they weren't able to become citizens because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and restrictions, at that time on Chinese naturalization. The Supreme Court considered whether he was a citizen. Essentially what had happened is he had left the United States, he had gone to China, and then he was seeking to come back to the United States. And the Chinese Exclusion Acts were in effect at that time. So, without citizenship, he wouldn't have been able to come back. He argued that he was a citizen, and he won before the Supreme Court. And what's interesting, and which we can talk about a bit more, is that the government in that case, in arguing that Wong Kim Ark was not a citizen, made a lot of the same arguments that the government is making today. it's really like a case of deja vu in terms of looking back at what they were arguing at that time and what they're arguing now. And that's something that we've really tried to point out to the courts, because Wong Kim Ark, of course, is binding Supreme Court precedent. And so it binds, the courts all over this country. So yeah, I think that's something that's very, very important to note. And finally, I'll just say that this executive order is just a tremendous break from the centuries of practice and of law that enshrine this principle of birthright citizenship. It's been extremely clearly established by all of the things that you mentioned: Wong Kim Ark, the 14th Amendment, the legislative history of the 14th Amendment, which we can talk about, the common law, that children of non-citizens born in this country were citizens themselves. So this is just a tremendous break from centuries of tradition and practice.
We kind of glazed past it on the show the other day, but can you explain what the 1940 Nationality Act is? That I think that's what you mean by the legislative aspect of it. Am I correct in that?
So I was referring to, actually, sorry, the legislative history of the 14th Amendment itself. And that's the debates leading up to that, where the members of Congress at that time are talking about birthright citizenship. And, a senator actually asks, would this include, the children of non-citizens, as if that's a bad thing. And, the proponents, he was an opponent of the 14th Amendment, and the proponents say, yeah, it totally includes, these people, the children of non-citizens. So it was something that they actually did consider at that time. I can talk about the 1940 Nationality Act as well, which is sort of an alternate grounds for, why the executive order is unlawful. In addition to violating the 14th Amendment, it also violates this statutory protection, stemming from the 1940 Act that, additionally establishes birthright citizenship. So it's two different violations, two levels of protection for people born in the United States to non-citizens.
What's the short version of what that 1940 Act says and how it relates to this?
Yeah, so it uses very similar language. The language, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, is the subject to the jurisdiction thereof language. So all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens, and that same language is used within the 1940 Act as well. And so the argument we're making is that Congress, at the time that it passed the 1940 Act, knew exactly what those words meant and knew it would include the children of non-citizens, partially because the Wong Kim Ark case, as you noted, Mike, had been decided like 40 years before that. Congress was extremely familiar that those words would apply 100% to the children of non-citizens born in the United States. And so it's an additional layer of protection because Congress itself at that time knew that that language plainly applied through Wong Kim Ark and as well as through the common law tradition.
What are the exceptions to the birthright citizenship? I know foreign diplomats' children would not be citizens, but what are the other exceptions?
So the other common law exceptions, yeah, the most relevant one is the one you just noted, children of diplomats. And so that's the one that, for current purposes is most relevant. But there are a few others. One of them is children born on foreign public ships. Doesn't come up too often, but is an exception. Also, children born of invading armies. So if like another country, sent its army into the United States and invaded, and then the army had children, then those children would not be citizens. And that argument, can talk a little bit about it, but, some folks, including, Fifth Circuit Judge James Ho, have argued that that argument would apply to non-citizens, in the United States now who are undocumented. There are many reasons that that's wrong, but that is an argument that they've made, that some folks have made. And then the final exception is children born on tribal lands. so born within sovereign Indian nations. And that was a very well-rooted exception that's really about how special the Indian tribes, their status is. They were, regulated by treaty. There were limitations in terms of being able to prosecute tribal members. That was all by treaty as well. So that's another exception, and one that the government right now in this case is trying to leverage, on its side.
Ira, I'm going to turn back to you, or you can also chime in, Hannah. I asked you guys the other day, I pulled the line from the executive order. It says the 14th Amendment has never been interpreted to extend citizenship universally to everyone born in the United States. And you said that there really wasn't a basis for that. But then when I was editing the show, it occurred to me that it's in a sort of slippery way, it's accurate because there are
Yeah.
exceptions. Is that kind of what they're doing there,
Yeah,
Ira?
I think there's no question about it, but it's clearly misleading in the sense that these are very, very narrow exceptions that existed even before the founding of the country. I mean, they existed in English law. English law was premised on the grounds of what they called jus soli, which is if you're born there, you are a citizen. And the concept was and is that if you're born in a place as a political and legal matter, you are under the jurisdiction of that country, under the protection of it and under its laws. And it didn't matter whether or not, whatever your status of your family was before, except these narrow exceptions, because those narrow exceptions had always been implied by common law. When we founded the Republic, the only common law we had was British law. And so we borrowed very, very heavily. And, many of the debates that you hear even in the Supreme Court these days, since many of the justices are what they call originalists, they go back to what the founders said. What were they thinking? What was in the original founding documents? And when you look at that in this case, it's pretty conclusive that, if you were born here, period. And in fact, as Justice Sotomayor says in the Casa versus Trump case, Trump v. Casa case, she goes through the language and she says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. In other words, it's right in the 14th Amendment. And she says, quote, few constitutional questions can be answered by resort to the text of the Constitution alone, but this is one of them. The 14th Amendment guarantees birthright citizenship. It says if you're born here, you're a citizen. And, what Hannah was saying, of course, is they latched on to what subject to the jurisdiction means to say, well, that's not always so. But the reality is it always has been interpreted to mean what we're talking about, which is the very, very narrow exceptions, and to be subject to the jurisdiction. And Justice Sotomayor quotes a dictionary from 1865, means simply to be bound to its authority and its laws. So if you're bound to the authority and its laws and you're born in that place, as the British said for 3 centuries before the founding of the Republic, that you were a citizen of the country. Yes, to answer the question, it was a bit misleading. And as Hannah pointed out, it's the very same argument that was rejected in the 1890s. So this isn't something where, oh, we finally discovered that there's an exception, and this is how we can interpret the exception. The executive order on its face is ridiculous. And I think this administration knew that. And as we talked about on the case that went to the Supreme Court, and this is always, I think, the problem in reporting on Supreme Court cases. When the decision came down in Trump v. Casa, everyone said, well, the president won. Well, the issue wasn't birthright citizenship. And the reason why it wasn't directly on birthright citizenship is that the lawyers for the government, who are very smart, very well knew that if they had brought that issue directly to the court, they would have lost. So what they did is they brought a totally different issue, a technical issue about the scope of an injunction, that is, the scope of the power of a judge to enter an order directing the government to do something. And the issue, therefore, in Trump was not birthright citizenship at all. It was, what is the scope of an injunction that a district court sitting anywhere in America can enter? And the court said, and even there, they haven't definitively said it, but generally they said they don't like what we call universal injunctions. That is, we don't want a judge sitting in San Francisco, where Hannah is, or sitting in Miami, one judge out of the hundreds of federal judges, making an order that has the effect on everybody in America, every other judge and so forth, and every court in the United States. Because what that does is it allows for what we lawyers call forum shopping. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, when the shoe was on the other foot, when Biden was in power and Biden was elected president, they started to do the same thing, but they didn't go to San Francisco or New York as we did in the Haitian case. They went to the Western District of Louisiana or the Northern District and Southern Districts of Texas, because those were the most conservative judges in the country, and they were within the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the most conservative court of appeals in the country. But when that was going on for 4 years, the Supreme Court did nothing about it, although people grumbled about this idea of having one judge sitting in the Western District of Louisiana making the law for the entire country. Well, now that the shoe was on the other foot and the liberals were doing this to Trump, it went to the Supreme Court on that issue. And the court basically has said, we don't like universal injunctions in that form. And without getting into too technical an argument, they didn't dismiss the possibility of ever having that. And they didn't dismiss the possibility of having what we call class action, which really has the same effect. And they didn't dismiss the possibility for many other technical reasons and reasons that support, in my view, very conservative policies, but it's a double-edged sword also, is they didn't dismiss the idea that you can have a claim under the Administrative Procedures Act, which is an act that governs administrative agencies, that has the same effect, because there's a provision of the Administrative Procedures Act that says, in effect, that you can declare that a court has the power to declare that a regulation that was passed in effect has no effect. And that has the same effect practically as saying something has no effect nationwide. And indeed, when we did the Haitian case in New York, that's exactly what we relied on. We relied on the Administrative Procedures Act and said the president didn't have the authority to cut off the time period under the regulations for Haitians to get TPS. And the judge entered an order saying that that act by the administration violated the Administrative Procedures Act and therefore is effective throughout the country. So it's the same issue. It's not that this has gone away, but it's important, I think, for all of you to know that this had nothing to do directly with birthright citizenship, and the court has not ruled on that. And as Hannah is going to tell you, because she's worked on a number of these cases, in virtually every single case, I think, in the United States, all the federal courts have said birthright citizenship means what the Constitution made it very clearly to mean, which is if you're born here, you're a citizen. Full stop.
We got a question from somebody who's watching, and I was going to ask you this later, but I'll ask you now. Like, I will presumably at some point the Supreme Court have to weigh in on the challenge to birthright citizenship from the executive order, and if so, what would your crystal ball say about how they'll deal with that if they actually deal with it?
Go ahead, Hannah. You've worked
Yeah,
on
I'm,
it.
I'm happy to start us off. So yeah, I think everyone sort of agrees that it will go there. Actually, funny enough, so our cases, we have two cases right now, and I can talk about the difference between them. One's a class action, which Ira just mentioned. Both of them originated in the District of New Hampshire, and our judge there actually, funny enough, has said in both of his opinions, this will be resolved ultimately by the Supreme Court. He keeps sort of saying that, and I think everyone agrees that it will go there. It probably won't go for a little while. These cases, the first wave of these cases is in the appellate courts. Actually, my boss is going to be doing oral argument in our case before the First Circuit in Boston next week, at the end of next week, in one of our cases that originated in New Hampshire. There's then this sort of second wave of class action cases that sort of come directly out of the Trump versus Casa decision that Ira was describing. In terms of the question of like, how will the Supreme Court rule when they actually have the merits before them? I would say that I'm quite optimistic that they would, find the same thing that, as Ira noted, every single court has found to this point, that birthright citizenship clearly is protected by the Constitution, clearly is protected by the statute. Note that they could come out, either way would still protect birthright citizenship. It's, as we were discussing, it's just so clearly established under the Constitution, given, the long common law history, the plain text that Ira was mentioning, the legislative history that we were talking about, where the actual framers of the 14th Amendment, the members of Congress, are actually talking about this directly. And then certainly Wong Kim Ark, even though at the Supreme Court level, of course, right, they can reconsider these things, and they do, at times overrule their precedent. Obviously, we saw that with the Dobbs decision. I don't expect them to do that here. This would just be such a tremendous sea change in how citizenship is conceptualized in this country that, has been the case for centuries, as we've talked about with the common law, the 14th Amendment. I just don't think that they are going to find in favor of the government. So, perhaps the government, sort of knew that, and maybe that's why, for example, when they were, going up to the Supreme Court this first time, they didn't even, basically raise the merits of the claim. And Justice Sotomayor points that out, that they, didn't even, really bring that before the court. And Ira mentioned that as well, that the government attorneys, knew that this, probably is a losing issue for them, given the really strong authority that we have on our side. This is just not their strongest issue, I would say. So, I am optimistic that when it does go before the Supreme Court will, come out correctly on it and find that birthright citizenship extends broadly only to, like basically to everyone except for the very, very, very narrow exceptions that we've discussed.
Could it be that this executive order, because it was definitely going to be challenged and definitely make it to the Supreme Court, was put out in order to address the nationwide injunctions? Does that make sense? I mean, it seems like if every judge says that this is not something that's going to go, and they took it to the Supreme Court for the injunctions, could it be that that was what the plan was?
It could have been, but my view of it and, following the court, I think there's a much deeper problem and issue. The Supreme Court's walking a tightrope, and they have to pick and choose the battles in which they are going to fight Trump, if they're going to fight him at all. Some of them they agree with him on, so there is no fight. But others, I think, like birthright citizenship, do they want to directly confront him with the possibility, of course, that he will just ignore them? And then the court becomes irrelevant, and then we have a full-blown fascist government and or as the people in polite conversation say, a constitutional crisis. So what is really going on here, I think, is kind of a little bit of a dance, and it's not just on this issue. I've written on this on many other issues. There's what they call the shadow docket of the Supreme Court, which I call the Trump docket, because as Justice Sotomayor said, when the Trump administration wants something, they seem to have the court on speed dial. And the Supreme Court has, on many occasions now, done things that they historically have never done. In other words, if you're seeking an emergency stay in the United States Supreme Court, it's a big deal. And most of the time, the court does not grant emergency stays. They say, as Hannah was suggesting before, you go to the district court, then you go to the Court of Appeals, and we hear what they have to say about the issue, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. Well, the solicitor under Trump has been to the Supreme Court, I don't know, 13, 15, 20 times already, asking for emergency stays, most of which he has gotten from this court. It's extraordinary. I mean, in my career, I sought emergency stays not very often because lawyers don't usually do that. And when I did, it was not well received by the Supreme Court normally. So it's very difficult to get a stay in the Supreme Court. And so what happened here, again, is that they're kind of dancing around the issue. They could have said, quite frankly, they could have just said, we're not going to grant the relief in Trump v. Casa because the underlying claim, and this, of course, is what Justice Sotomayor says in the dissent, in order to get a stay in the Supreme Court or get a decision in the Supreme Court, you have to have an underlying harm. What was the underlying harm here? It had to do with birthright citizenship. And had they decided that issue, they clearly would have disposed of the whole case. We never would have gotten to universal injunctions or anything else. And the court has now done this a number of times, and principally in another area, I think that Hannah and the ACLU have worked on, which is the Alien Enemies Act. You know, I am amazed at somebody who watches the Supreme Court very closely to see what they did with that. When the first time it came up to them, even though the ACLU didn't raise it, the court could have just simply said the Alien Enemies Act just doesn't apply. It doesn't make any sense. If you read the language of the Alien Enemies Act, it says you can only invoke it if we're at war, if there is an incursion of foreign troops in effect in the United States, or there's an invasion. And we don't have any of those things. And so they could have just simply said, we don't want to talk about the due process rights or anything else, which were the issues they kind of danced around about and talked about, well, if you send somebody to El Salvador, they have to have a due process right. What they should have simply said is, the Alien Enemies Act doesn't apply. It's not applicable. The president's just making this up, but they did not want to confront the president. And this, of course, has implications for many other issues. And one of the things I think all of you should think about is what happens if the president says tomorrow, I think there are so many disturbances in the streets that I'm declaring martial rule. And you're looking at it just like he tried to do in Los Angeles, and you're looking at it and you're saying, well, it's ridiculous. Whatever happened in Los Angeles could be handled by the local police. Why do you have to send in National Guard, and why do you have to send in the Marines? He sent 200 Marines here to Florida for this alligator Alcatraz nonsense. And, you know, the bottom line is at some point, if the court doesn't stand up and say, he's lying or he's just making this up or martial rule is not applicable, we're in an awful lot of trouble. So I think those are the big issues as to what's going to happen here. And they've danced around it as they have in the birthright citizenship case.
If the behavior of the Supreme Court is them trying to not find themselves in a constitutional crisis, might that not be a constitutional crisis?
Well, I think that's what I'm saying. I think, in
Yeah, I
fact,
mean, it's like that, yeah.
I think in fact we have a problem when they're looking at the Alien Enemies Act and can't just clearly say it doesn't apply. I mean, it just simply doesn't apply. And it's like, the emperor has no clothes. It's the proverbial we won't confront the real issue. So let's talk about everything else. Let's talk about due process. Let's talk about, that they haven't treated these people fairly in sending them to El Salvador. But they sent them to El Salvador because they invoked an act that doesn't apply. So, yeah, I think we do have a crisis of that nature, and this court is trying to pick whatever fights it's going to pick with the president, but it has chosen, at least at this point, not to be confrontational.
Hannah, what is the current state of birthright citizenship with this executive order being litigated? Like, if a child is born right now, are they a citizen? And if it were to be upheld, do you know would that apply to people who are citizens because they were born here? I mean, is it, I just don't know how that all breaks down. Can you explain?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to answer your first question, anyone who's born here, to parents of any status, with the exception of the diplomats, I know we already talked about that, but other than that, they are a citizen. And that's true of someone born today, tomorrow, next week. The Supreme Court, in its decision, did basically stay its decision for 30 days. The decision was issued June 27th. So, obviously doing the math, we're rapidly approaching that date. However, as I mentioned, we did bring a class action case on behalf of a nationwide class of all babies who would be stripped of citizenship under this executive order. And we recently won preliminary relief on behalf of that class. All this is to say, the long and short of it is, every single baby born, even next week after the Supreme Court stay, expires or whatever, all those babies are all citizens. And so, and that's, I think, something that's really, really important, important for people to know, who are expecting children who would be affected by this. Their babies are protected as we sit here today. To answer the other part of your question, the executive order isn't retroactive. So someone who was born, let's say, 20 years ago, who wouldn't be a citizen, if born under the executive order, is still a citizen. There's no stripping of citizenship. And so, I think that's all really important to know in terms of, hopefully easing people's fears. People obviously are extremely worried about this, and reasonably so. These are people who are expecting children. They're, imminently expecting children. And that's supposed to be obviously such a joyful time in one's life. And instead they're worried about, will my child be a citizen or not? And we get, floods of emails from folks across the country who are affected. And it's a range of people, it's everyone ranging from asylum seekers, who have fled, violence in their home countries and persecution and are now in the United States, student visa holders, H-1B. It's a really a wide swath of people that the executive order has targeted, in declaring that their children are not citizens. And so to be able to, have our victory just a couple weeks ago, and have this nationwide class both certified and have relief granted is really exciting. Just to know that starting next week, people are still citizens. Even if a baby is born Monday of next week instead of Monday of this week. Which without that order, that wouldn't be the case. Without the class certification win that we had a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think they may, notwithstanding that, be provocative and say after July 27th, we're not going to issue a birth certificate, for example, to somebody in North Carolina or, somewhere else, and then try and challenge it or say they're not entitled to any benefits that American citizens are entitled to who were born after July 27th. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to do that just to be provocative and then say that the order that Hannah and the ACLU has obtained doesn't really apply, even though it's a class action lawsuit, because the class is somehow defective, or it should only apply in, Massachusetts or somewhere else. So I'm expecting, even if it's just for publicity's sake, because part of what's going on here is a campaign of fear. And, Hannah mentioned it about that. I've heard, I have clients where people call who are American citizens by birth and are carrying passports, and they say, "Can I travel?" I mean, people are really, really worried. And it's all nonsense in a way. It's all theater. It's all designed to get people afraid and intimidated and not speak their minds and so forth. I think that's a message to all of you also. I mean, people need to speak up. I mean, their whole plan is to get everyone afraid. I mean, it's the same thing about denaturalization, which is all nonsense, because to denaturalize someone, it's a huge effort. It's a civil trial that goes on for weeks. I've tried a number of denaturalization cases. It's not something where the president can wave his wand and say you're denaturalized. So he has to go to federal court. He has to prove the case. And they have a very high burden of proof. And that's why there are very, very few denaturalization cases. There are 20 million naturalized citizens in the United States. You don't hear about denaturalization very much. But it's, again, another tactic, a scare tactic to people to make them. My view of the denaturalization thing is many of the people who are naturalized have family members who may be subject to, some of the other kinds of treatment that the administration is engaged in, like deportation and so forth. And they want to shut up the American citizens by saying, if you open your mouth, we're going to denaturalize you. And people don't know that you can't just be denaturalized. It doesn't work like that.
Is there precedent, Ira, for deporting people to countries that they have no connection to? I
There
mean, is that it?
wasn't until this administration.
Okay, so this is
Um,
this is totally new.
it's totally new. Well, I'm sure there have been examples in history. The United States got so frustrated at one point in Carlos Marcello, who was the mafia boss of New Orleans, that they just picked him up and took him to Guatemala, but he eventually came back. But generally, the answer is no. And the statute, to me, this is another example. The statute to me is quite clear. The statute says you have the right to designate your country of deportation, and most people would designate their own country unless they're afraid to go there. So who is this aimed at? This is really aimed at people who are seeking asylum or what we call Convention Against Torture relief, people who are afraid to go back to their home country. So, and normally what we do with those people, we say they can stay here unless they have assurances that if they go back to their country, they're not going to be persecuted in one way or another. And so, what does this administration do? They say, okay, we're not going to send you back to Venezuela. We'll send you to South Sudan. We'll send you to Libya in the middle of a war, a civil war going on. So this is kind of another, scare tactic. It's another form of extreme cruelty to people. And it does affect a number of people. But when you're talking about 20 million or 10 million people who are here, who the government wants to deport, you have to keep in mind that all of these things that they're doing affect a very, very small group of people. After all, they took 200 people only to El Salvador, right? 300 people at most. The people they've taken to third countries, it's in the hundreds. Um, but and so it's kind of like theater. It's to get you very excited, very upset, and so forth, and very distracted. But they're doing it, and they can do it. The court has allowed them. The Supreme Court, in another one of these cases, granted a stay of an order. A judge entered a 55-page detailed order as to why it was illegal to take people to third countries, and the Supreme Court, again on speed dial, granted the Solicitor General a stay of that order, so they're free, at least temporarily, to take people. And this, again, is another avoidance tactic. The Supreme Court has not ruled on the merits. In fact, the Supreme Court has said nothing, which is even more amazing. In other words, there's a standard for a stay. You have to meet, it's called Neekin. It's a Supreme Court case, and it said you have to meet these 4 criteria to get a stay. They said nothing. They just said we're granting a stay. And there's a whole series of orders like that in immigration. So it's clear they don't want to take on the president on immigration right now, but they're not ruling on the merits. There may be a case, as Hannah was saying, with birthright citizenship. Eventually, there's going to be a case that's going to go to the Supreme Court on the merits of whether or not you can send people to third countries, but they haven't yet reached that decision. So as of now, the court's order is stayed, saying it's illegal, but eventually that issue is going to be decided by the Supreme Court. And it's interesting, in one of the decisions, it's the last thing I'll say about it, in one of the decisions, Justice Kavanaugh said, oh, in effect, oh, you're making a big deal about all these stays, but we're the Supreme Court, we make the final decision. And what he really means is we're granting these stays, but eventually these cases are going to come to us. And who knows? I mean, given where public opinion now has shifted dramatically in just the last month in favor of immigration, against the Trump administration's immigration policy, maybe they're just waiting. Maybe by next year or sometime at the end of this year, things will look a lot different.
Just want to remind everybody watching that if you want to have a question put into the hopper, just use the chat function and it'll pop up on the screen here. Hannah, what's the next thing that might happen in these cases? Like, what are you looking at on the horizon with the cases with birthright citizenship?
Yeah, so right now these cases are on appeal, so before the circuit courts. And there's a couple different waves of cases. So the first wave was cases that were filed, basically the day that, Trump took office and this executive order was signed. I think we filed like within, maybe a couple hours of that or something. So we so that was filed back in January. That case is now up on appeal. So that's going to be argued at the First Circuit in Boston at the end of next week. And that will be argued on the merits, as we're talking about. So on the actual question of whether the executive order is unconstitutional and unlawful. And that's sort of the way that, that first wave of cases is basically all in that posture of, waiting for those merits arguments. There was one in the Ninth Circuit that happened a couple months ago. That panel hasn't issued a decision yet. There's going to be one in the Fourth Circuit as well in September. Then the second wave of cases, the class action, as I described, we got our order a couple weeks ago. The government still hasn't appealed. Probably they will, but they have not yet. So that's sort of the status of that order. That will probably eventually go to the appellate court as well. And then after that, these cases eventually, as we were just discussing, will go to the Supreme Court. They will, like some iteration of them, will return to the Supreme Court for the merits. The Supreme Court at some point will have to weigh in on the merits of these cases in the way that they didn't do in the first iteration, as we were describing.
Ira and Hannah, you might be able to weigh in on this too. One of our reporters was talking to an immigration attorney in Miami who was working with some families who had family members in this detention center in the Everglades, which is right down the road from where we are. I mean, it's in our listening area. And she said that the immigration attorney said he had never experienced anything that was so lawless, was the term that he used, in terms of like how it was being administered, the way it was built without having permits for environmental things, but also just like he said he was getting a runaround, like the state says it's not theirs, but the feds say it's not theirs. And like, do you have any clarity on this detention center that's right down the road that's been named, what it's been named?
Yeah. A couple of things. First of all, the price tag. We're talking about already the governor has spent $500 million, or it's slated to be $500 million. And when we think about what we could do in this state with $500 million in terms of education and healthcare and a bunch of other things, it's pretty outrageous that they're spending that kind of money. The second thing is that it's all run, from what we can tell now, by contractors through the state, which raises issues as to who's getting the money. And by the way, this is the same issue writ small in the state that will be writ large when the $140 billion are given away to different contractors and so forth to build prisons around the United States that the Trump administration is trying to do. So the second question, I think the Miami Herald, and hopefully other newspapers have had very good coverage on this, is like, who's getting this money? Who are the contractors? What's their relationship with the governor? Why were they chosen? They weren't chosen on any, open bidding process. It was all done on an emergency basis. So it's the old story about let's follow the money, find out what's going on. Then you get to the question of the operation of the facility itself. And this is something I've been fighting really since 1980, because the Haitians were the first people who were detained. Most Americans don't know that prior to 1980, we didn't detain immigrants, with certain minor exceptions. During the McCarthy period, they detained, people they thought were, quote, communists and so forth. But generally, we never detained people. People would come across the border, they'd be released, and then they'd have a hearing at some point in the future and either be deported or not. But we never had a, quote, detention policy. It started with President Reagan, because I was involved in that litigation years ago, with the idea of having private prisons. Just so you know the background of this, The first private prison was the predecessor to a company called CoreCivic, and it was operated by the major donor of the Republican Party from Tennessee, who was about to go bankrupt. And by giving private prisons, including that CoreCivic, and the other major one now is Geo, giving them these contracts, they created and began to create this idea of detention. It's now blossomed, in a very negative way all across the country. But the detention of people raises a number of issues. One is, do the people who are actually detaining them have the competence to do it? Remember, immigration is now detaining more people than the Bureau of Prisons. Pretty amazing. Okay, and under Trump's plan, it will probably wind up where they're detaining more people than all the prisons in the United States. And do the people have the ability to do it? And the question and the answer is no. 13 people have already died in detention since Trump is president. The people running these facilities, including the one here in Florida, have no great expertise in how to handle people who, by the way, are not criminals, right? I mean, Trump keeps saying they're the worst of the worst and so forth, but it turns out, as the Herald has reported, that the majority of people now being detained at this facility have no criminal records at all. And then when you look at the people who, quote, have criminal records, they're not the worst of the worst. They're the people who, for example, were put there because they were driving without a license, because they were just trying to get to work or something like that. So most of the people who are in these facilities are not criminals in the way that, I think all of us on this think about hardcore, violent criminals. They're not. And so what are we doing? We're detaining people in what's civil detention, because after all, immigration is civil. It's not criminal, it's civil detention. It's like if you put somebody in a mental hospital, it's civil detention. I mean, imagine if we started to put people who were debtors back in prison. That's what this is the equivalent of, and Americans need to understand that. This is civil, not criminal detention. So you have people running these places who, for the most part, don't know very much about running prisons. And this one, to get back to your question, Mike, was totally slapdash put together. They have, by contractors, they're scrambling around trying to find people to work there, because who would want to work in the middle of the Everglades, and with 90-degree heat, and traveling there and traveling back? So they don't even have enough personnel there. It was not set up to be a facility where you can have an attorney-client relationship with the individuals. The medical part apparently is not very good, which is why you're going to see more and more people have serious medical problems who are being kept there. And then it's certainly not hurricane proof. So if we have a hurricane in the next month or two, they don't even have a serious plan to evacuate people from that facility. And what's going to happen? And we already know that the way it was constructed, that they've already had flooding there. So the answer is, from the standpoint of due process and the standpoint of actually having people who can get attorneys there and access, it doesn't look at all even like the other detention centers, which are not great either, but it certainly has nothing that even remotely resembles the idea of, I'm an attorney, I call up, I say I want to come and see my client. And that's what the Herald has reported. People have been calling, trying to talk to their client. They're telling them they don't even have lists, and they don't even know who's there on any given day. So it's a total disaster from any perspective of looking at it. And again, this is the administration of publicity. These are all publicity stunts. This is, I call the governor mini-me, because he always tries to be like the president. And The bottom line is, so he shows up, he builds this facility, brings the president in, and it's all theater, basically.
Anything you'd like to add, Hannah? Because we're going to open it up to questions from everybody. I've got one other question, but you can follow up if you'd like.
Yeah. I completely agree, of course, with everything that Ira put forward, and we're very concerned about alligator Alcatraz, as it's called. We have litigators here that are suing and are bringing, some of these challenges on access to counsel, as Ira was describing, and some of the other issues that are already happening at this facility. The only other thing I'll mention is that, I am very cognizant that this audience is in Florida. And, as I mentioned earlier, Florida, really has, the state government really has made an effort to get involved in immigration enforcement. Certainly through Alligator Alcatraz, through the laws I was describing, Senate Bill 4C. There was Senate Bill 1718 a few years ago, the transport ban that we're litigating. There are even some communities in Florida, including Jacksonville, passed its own illegal entry law, where if you're undocumented and you enter the city of Jacksonville, you've committed a crime. And all this is to say that, it's definitely so critical for people to be involved, in politics in their local communities, and to make sure that, the politics change for the better, because unfortunately, in the state, there's a very conservative legislature and, governor, of course, attorney general, who's the defendant in, some of our cases. They're really pushing the envelope, as Ira described, and really, putting themselves out there as, this very conservative state government. And so the more that people can do on the ground to, whether it's protesting or calling their representatives or electing new representatives or talking to people in the community, it's so critical, because, it has been surprising to me how much state work I'm doing right now, or how much I have done. And it's really a problem for people. And, just to give an example of this law, the Senate Bill 4C, there was a United States citizen who was arrested, unfortunately, under this law back in April. And this was after the court had already, ordered the officers to stop enforcing this law. He was still pulled over. He was a US citizen. He eventually got released, thankfully, but, there were still arrests that were happening even after the court order that we secured. This certainly is something that, really impacts people on the ground. All of these policies, whether it's Alligator Alcatraz or Senate Bill 4C, legal entry law, or Operation Tidal Wave of, cooperation with ICE, all of these things really affect people in the communities. And that's why, we've made it a priority, even with everything going on with the Trump administration. We have focused significant resources in Florida because of all of this. And so, it's a super important place for people to, be active and get involved, really critical.
And
Go ahead, Ira.
if I can just, I'm sorry, if I could just follow up. So people understand the state has no authority even to operate a place like this place in the Everglades. It's all based on a provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 287G. And that section says the state, under certain circumstances, can cooperate with the federal government if it chooses to do so. But it need not choose to do so. And one of the things, when Trump talks about sanctuary cities, he's really talking about states and cities that have chosen not to cooperate. And it's not even not to cooperate at all, but not to cooperate on certain things. We live in a state, unfortunately, that has gone way overboard to try and prove that we're as tough as the president on immigration. And therefore, what we have are these 287G agreements, And apparently, the first thing I asked when I learned about this place in the Everglades is it included in the 287G agreement? Because if it's not, it's operated totally illegally. And it seems like it's pretty vague, actually, as to whether or not we can operate as state actors, whether or not we can operate a facility like this, a prison. And so what Hannah is saying is doubly important for all of us who live in this state to start putting pressure on state representatives, many of whom, and particularly on the supermajority side and the Republicans, have basically given the governor full authority to enter into any kind of agreement he wants. But we don't have to do that in Florida. We can enter into an agreement, for example, that says if it's a serious criminal, yes, then we should do something about it. We should have detainers on those people. If it has to do with certain kinds of issues on border security, yeah, maybe they can do that. But they've given them a blank check, and that's what's resulted in all the kinds of problems that Hannah and I have been talking about.
We are going to now open it up, or I guess Jim will open it up to where everybody will be visible, and you'll be able to raise your hand to ask questions directly. So if you
So
can,
we went off of focus mode, and I know there's Liz Matt has a couple of questions she wants to ask, but I do need to I need to announce our next program and then also to ask two questions that people have submitted to me, and then hopefully Liz can get her questions in. Um, our next program is going to be on September the 25th, and we have the Chair Emeritus of the Cato Institute, our efforts to reach across the aisle and to talk with other organizations and people who share our values of simply let's debate issues, but let's not go to an autocratic society. And so we've got a wonderful program, and he's going to talk about can the Supreme Court protect our democracy? So it ties nicely into this program, and it will come immediately before the October Supreme Court session starts, and we'll have an idea probably then what some of the issues are that they'll be looking at. So very timely program. Two quick questions that sort of tie together for Ira and Hannah. One is that I would like if you've already mentioned a little bit about what can we as average individuals do to make a difference, reaching out to our senators, voicing these kinds of issues. If you could touch on a couple of those things to make sure we reinforce it. And then secondly, one of the persons asked a question about, is it too much of a stretch to what is happening today versus the 1930s in Germany? And that's probably not a 30-second answer, but maybe you can give a quick answer on that. And it ties also into the naming of alligator Alcatraz and some folks that are saying that the rest of us should not be using that was a term that was designed intentionally. I noticed, Ira, you didn't use it, but that
Yeah,
was a
I
term.
agree 100%. And it's true of everything, like the big, beautiful bill. I was cringing yesterday because now that they got the big, beautiful bill passed, which everybody was using that language, now they've gone back yesterday when they raised all the fees and they're going to raise your fees on Obamacare are going to go up 50 to 90% in the next 3 or 4 months. All of a sudden, it's now HR 1 reconciliation bill. So yeah, I mean, I view it's, I've said it ad nauseum now, but I really view a lot of what Trump's genius is just it's all theater. And the more you play into it, the more he's able to do it. I mean, you had Democrats calling it a big, beautiful bill. I mean, just it's crazy. And the same thing with alligator Alcatraz. When I talk about it, I talk about this horrible hellhole in the Everglades.
Good. Okay. So what can we do to help? You've touched on it a little bit. What can we as participants here this evening do to make a difference along this journey? Hannah, you want to start?
Yeah. So just yeah, picking up, where we left off. Yeah, definitely, getting involved in politics, including local politics. Yeah, as I mentioned, in Jacksonville, there's actually this law that, the city council passed that's an illegal entry law. And yeah, so certainly making sure you're involved in local, state, politics, as well as, of course, federal, like contacting your representatives as well. It's really important. And I think that would, that certainly does, make a difference, especially in numbers, especially if, a whole group doesn't, and especially in a smaller community as well. Letting our government know that these policies are not popular, that, we don't want, for these prisons to be built and for immigration law to be enforced in this draconian way that sweeps up like anyone and everyone, as Ira was saying. Another thing just going along with that, certainly like protesting, all of that, is definitely very important, especially like tied to these immigration issues, and showing that, they're not popular, showing that, like people will pay a political price. Representatives will pay a political price if they, make these decisions and do these things. Another sort of area, another couple that I'll mention. One is know your rights, and so just basically, helping immigrants within your community to sort of make sure that people, know what they should do if someone approaches them and, claims to be an ICE officer, or, just like takes them off the street, stuff like that, make it, which unfortunately, I mean, it's terrible we're talking about this stuff. It's terrible that, we've seen this stuff in our country. And yet, unfortunately, we have. And so, making sure that, especially folks who, are not citizens, are familiar with their rights, know what they, should do in that situation, and have an action plan, being prepared. And there's a lot of resources that we have, like at the ACLU on our website, that are like know your rights resources. So definitely, spreading those around, to folks that, making sure that they're prepared, making sure they have an action plan. And then also volunteering, and contributing to nonprofit organizations that, are supporting immigrants during this, extremely challenging time. I will say that, in 2016, 2017, there was definitely like an outpouring of support. And, now I think we are seeing some of that. We're seeing, protests, we're seeing some of that. But there also is, unfortunately, some apathy. There are people that are sort of just, this is the way it is. And, this is the way that the federal government is these days. And they're not engaged. And I think we just have to really fight that. It's extremely important.
Thank you. Ira, do you have any other additions of things we should be doing?
Well, I think one thing, just it's almost a psychological battle. I think this administration, both on the state and federal level, kind of present themselves as inevitable. And to make the analogy, to Hitler, remember Hitler with a million troops. Everybody's seen that picture, and Hitler's standing up there, and it looks like everything is inevitable, and they're going to do whatever they want to do. And I think people need to understand most Americans, whether they know all the facts or not, are basically decent, humane people. And I think, when Trump sold them the bill of goods about millions of people coming across the border, even though the border's been closed, by the way, by Biden since July of 2024, you should all know that. He actually closed the border at that point. But even though he sold them this bill of goods about, we're being invaded, and most people, do support the idea of not having millions of people come across the border. And he sold people the goods that there were wild maniacs running around raping and killing people. Most Americans now are waking up to the fact that that isn't what's happening. What's happening now is they're arresting your neighbors, your friends, your caregivers, your people who actually pay taxes. I can tell you this week I had somebody who's been in the United States paid taxes for 35 years with the hope that he would become a resident of the United States. Trump 6 months ago said they're comparing the tax records with your status. So if you pay taxes, they can pick you up now and deport you. So we are losing $92 billion a year in taxes that are paid by undocumented people. 92 billion. And the bottom line is that most people don't know these things, but I think most people now, and we're seeing the polls starting to reflect that, most people are understanding now that this isn't about criminals, the worst of the worst, or anything like that. It's about hardworking people who came here and tried to build a new life, probably like your parents. I know my parents, my father, your grandparents, your great grandparents, Trump's father, whoever it is. And the bottom line is, I think it's not inevitable. What they're doing is not inevitable. And I think you got to get energized and start talking and start being in the face of, particularly on a local level, as Hannah's saying, of the members of the state, our state senators and our state representatives, and start letting them know they're not getting voted. We're not voting you in again. We're not going to have another supermajority Republicans with a governor who thinks he's a mini Trump. It's just not, that's not what Florida is about. And the bottom line is that you have that power. And I know, people think it's trite to say, oh, write your congressman and stuff. I don't think you should write them. I think you should call them and demand a meeting. Sure, right. So that's my advice on that front. And the other thing is, I would advise you all to do social media. I'm 76 years old and I'm on TikTok 3 times a week. Okay. And if I can do it, you can do it. And, and all I talk about in my case is about immigration and what the truth is about what's really going on so people know. Because I think most people don't. And most people, the majority of people now get their news from social media, not from, when I was growing up, there was Walter Cronkite, and that was the news.
Right, right.
It's not like that anymore.
Well, Ira and Hannah, you've been very, very gracious with your time. Mike, another wonderful time of being prepared and so well moderating. I don't see Liz's hand coming up she had a couple of questions, but we're at the witching hour.
Deanna has a question.
Okay, Dina.
Dean.
Dean. Okay, she has her hand up. We'll take one question and then folks that want to stay on, you're welcome to stay on and chat for a little bit, but I want to release our guests after this question. So where did you go? Here she is. You need to unmute, Dean. Need to unmute. Dina?
Try. Oh, there I am. This may sound naive, but and it's sort of a different part of what we've discussed this evening. And by the way, thank you so much for everything you said this evening. I'm curious how you actually become a citizen. You hear all these stories, like it breaks my heart to hear this gentleman was here for 35 years paying taxes and not a citizen. So I'm just going to throw a simple case out here. So someone shows up at the border asking for asylum, they come through, and now they're in the country. What happens?
Well,
That too simple a question?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question and a very complex question, which is why it makes it impossible to expect a sheriff in the state of Florida to
Right,
decide the person in front of them, are they legal or not legal, and then get
right.
immigration to arrest them. That's how crazy the system is. But somebody who applies for asylum, first of all, in order to become a citizen, you have to be a resident first. Normally, you have to be a resident for 5 years.
Oh,
That
okay.
means a green card, what you hear, green card, lawful permanent resident for 5 years. Then you can apply for citizenship. So residency and citizenship are two different things, but you first must be a resident before you can be a citizen. There
Where
are
does
some
one get
very
that?
minor exceptions to that rule, but 99.9% of the people must be residents before they're citizens. So how do they become a resident?
Right.
And that is an issue of great debate. If somebody has applied for asylum and they get asylum under our law after a year and a day, they can apply to become a resident. But it's very, very difficult to get political asylum in the United States. Most people don't
Okay.
understand that. It's not like, it was years and years ago. There are very high standards, very difficult to obtain. And often it takes a long time. Sometimes, immigration doesn't give it to you. So you have a deportation hearing where you go before a judge and try and convince the judge that you're entitled to asylum. And then the other major, major problem that we have is since 1990, we have not had a positive immigration law in the United States.
Right. Right.
That's 35 years. And one of the things we haven't had is the issuance of one more visa for people. In other words, whatever the allocation of visas we had before 1990 is exactly what we have today. So there are backlogs, and I'm going to tell you some of them, and you will be shocked. If you are a U.S. citizen from Mexico and you want to bring your brother or sister into the United States, the waiting time is 23 years.
Wow.
Okay. If you are from India and you are a high tech person working for Amazon and you want to get your residency because there's not only an overall quota, there's a country quota, you're waiting about 15 years. So, one of the major problems we have in the United States is this notion that, well, just wait outside. I don't know, why aren't you waiting online? Because those lines are so ridiculously long now that people just don't want to wait. For example, if you have a child and you're a resident of the United States, that child can't come in for 2 or 3 years. So what do? You left your 2-year-old child in another country while you're applying for the child to come in. And then there's just one more thing that you need to know. There's something in our law called the 3 and 10 year bar. And it's a technical thing and it's difficult to explain, but it's probably the most important thing that's happened since 1996. Before 1996, if you had somebody who was taking care of your elderly parent, a caregiver, or you had somebody who you really wanted to work for you, and I can tell you, because I've been practicing a long time, I used to have US senators, federal judges call me and say, I want to do the right thing. I want to make this person a resident of the United States. And before 1996, you were able to do that because the penalty was they had to go home to get their residency. They would go home for 2 weeks and come back. Those people now, if they go home, they can't come back for 10 years.
Oh,
That's why we
Wow.
have 10 million so-called illegal and undocumented people in the United States. They're people who may have come in on a visa and just stayed here, not legally, but
Right.
stayed here. and they stayed here for more than a year, and then somebody offered them a job, and they're hardworking and they're a good worker and they want to get them their residency. It's a three-step process, and the third step requires them to leave the United States. And when they leave, they can't come back for 10 years. So in those circumstances, they're not going to leave. And that's exactly why we have 10 to 20 million people. This was a law passed in 1996 called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. It was passed by a majority Republican Congress and signed by Bill Clinton.
Wow. I had
That's
no
why
idea.
we have the situation we have. No visas and a 10-year bar. That's why people come to the border.
Right.
Thanks,
That's
Ira.
what's really going on. So
Folks,
people understand that.
Thank you so much.
You're
I
welcome.
promised our guests that we wouldn't hold them past 8, but Liz Matt is one of the state's most active activists
Great.
in many different ways. And if you don't mind, let me have Liz unmute and tackle a question, and then we'll release you guys. You're welcome to stay, and we'll stay on for about another 15 minutes with people if they just want to chat. Liz?
I'm most grateful because my group in Bonita Springs, which has a very large Hispanic identified population, we've been involved in providing Know Your Rights literature since February, and very forcefully but secretly getting it all out. They are very, very concerned about their American-born children, and I'm trying to figure out what Hannah said. Are they off the hook, or is the fact that the Trump administration can appeal, meaning they can't breathe easily yet?
Well,
Yeah,
Hannah?
I think that certainly for now they are off the hook. Yeah, the order that we secured from a couple weeks ago will protect people starting next week, which is great. The Trump administration probably will appeal that order. They haven't yet. But, as we talked about, I definitely am very optimistic about our chances on the merits, both at the appellate courts, because those courts are all bound by the Wong Kim Ark decision that we were talking about, the Supreme Court decision from 1898. And so, then the question becomes, what does the Supreme Court do with it? And yeah, once again, I'm quite optimistic that they will come out the right way on this, given all of the authority that's on our side. So there still, probably will be appeals, but, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to maintain citizenship for everyone. And certainly for now, there's citizenship for everyone, which is great.
To avoid any confusion, Liz, I think what I was saying is they may try and do something as a publicity stunt, in some place in America. But I agree with Hannah. I think in the end, they're all citizens of the United States by birth.
Thank you. Now, I had 10 more questions. I don't need them answered. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Hannah, Ira, Mike, wonderful evening, wonderful program, scary stuff, cruel things happening. You've given us some hope with you guys on the firing line, and hopefully we will all play some type of a role, whatever we can, as visibly as we can to reinforce. We don't want the continuation of this dehumanizing cruelty that we are experiencing. It's not the nation we want to live in. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
So
Appreciate
Folks want to
it.
stay on for a little while, you're welcome to do so, and while we shut down here. But thank you.